I'm convinced the whole world just wants to be Jewish. Everyone started wearing masks just before Purim. They started panic buying just before Pesach. And then everyone started counting days and weeks in quarantine and refraining from taking a haircut just before the Omer. Then in July, I leave my house and everyone's standing in line to buy new clothes and have their haircut just before the 3 weeks. The 3 weeks, of course, that very sad period when we're not allowed to have our haircut, buy new clothes or hold weddings. So basically, like the rest of 2020.
Purim brings us some of our most colorful Tanakh figures, most of whom are presented in the book of Esther as somewhat of a caricature. We have the buffoon king, Achashverosh, we have the wicked Haman, and the heroic Mordechai. I think, however, that Esther is the most interesting figure in the book. In the book, Esther is the only character who really seems to change and develop and grow as the story progresses. To understand her character, I think we have to understand her on the backdrop of her tribe, which is, of course, the tribe of Binyamin, and maybe go even a little bit further back to her ancestress, Rachel. And what we know in the Tanakh, and the Midrash picks up on this as well, is that the Tanakh sometimes presents hereditary character traits, traits which are embodied in a tribe or a family line, right? These traits can be physical. So, for example, the tribe of Binyamin are excellent sharpshooters. Naphtali is considered to have the trait of swiftness, or they can be related to character, right? So, the tribe of Levi are passionate and impetuous. Yehuda is straightforward and bold. Right? And Chazal recognize what these, hereditary traits, and they recognize particularly with respect to Rachel that her descendants have many common traits, right, that are passed down from Rachel to her children, to Yosef and Binyamin, and subsequently to many of their illustrious descendants, whether it's Ephraim and Menashe, or King Shaul, or Esther and Mordechai as well. And one of the things that Chazal say with regard to Bnei Rachel is Nisan shaveh ugdulatan shaveh. Their trials are similar, and they rise to similar positions of eminence, of greatness. And here specifically, the Midrash points to the two figures of that we're going to be talking about today of the children of Rachel, and that is Yosef and Mordechai, or Mordechai and Esther. Well, that's one idea. We're not going to particularly develop that idea, but I draw your attention to this idea simply to note that Chazal are aware that there is this concept known as Baneha Shel Rachel, the descendants of Rachel, who seem to share several hereditary traits. They also talk about the fact that the children of Rachel seem to have a particular success in fighting Esav, in fighting Amalek. And there's another interesting point that they make about Baneha Shel Rachel, the descendants of Rachel, where they say Rachel tafsa pelech shtika. Rachel had a measure of silence. She used silence as a staff, as a crutch. Ve'amdu chol baneha ba'alei misterin. And all of her children had this kind of mysterious quality, or perhaps the ability to know how and when to use silence for their advantage. This is true about Yosef. It's true about Esther as well. Others of Rachel's descendants, such as Binyamin, who actually never speaks even once, and Shaul, who is often described as restraining himself from speaking. So this trait is certainly something which is worthy of note. And what we see is that already 3 different midrashim in Chazal recognize that there are common characteristics to what they call Baneha Shel Rachel, the descendants of Rachel. I want to talk today about one particular common element to the children of Rachel, and that is that Rachel's children are described as being beautiful. Now, they're not simply beautiful, right? But they seem to have a particularly compelling sort of beauty, right? A lot of people in Tanakh have beauty, but what we see with Rachel's children is that they have this kind of evocative quality, one that leads everyone around them to be drawn into their charisma, into their magic. What we see is that, and we'll talk about this in a moment, but the charm and the beauty that we see in the house of Rachel, what we see is that they seem to be aware of their charm and beauty. We'll see this. They enjoy it. They employ it, right? And this is perhaps especially evident when we examine the particular role of clothing in the lives and stories of the children of Rachel. So think, for example, of Yosef's coat, the extra clothes which Yosef gives to Binyamin, Esther's bigdei malchut, Shaul, who also is often described as wearing either bigdei malchut or taking off those clothes. We have Yerovam ben Navat, who is an Ephrati. He is from the tribe of Ephraim. And when he meets the prophet Achiah HaShiloni, also there we have a ripped coat. Oh, of course, Mordechai rips his clothes. So there's a lot of clothing going on in the stories of the children of Rachel. And we're going to get back to that in a moment. For the moment, I just want to note that the role of clothing suggests that the children of Rachel are aware of the importance of cultivating their external appearance. But I want to say something about the particular evocative quality of the beauty of the children of Rachel. As I said before, many figures in Tanakh are described as beautiful. Sarah, Rivka, Abigail. There are men as well. We have Avshalom, of course. David is Yefeh Einayim, right? Admoni im Yefeh Einayim, right? So we have many different figures in Tanakh that are described as beautiful, but there is only but there's one phrase in Tanakh that only describes the children of Rachel, and that is the phrase Yefeh Toar v'Yefeh Mar'eh. With Esther, there's a bit of a variation. Yefeh Toar v'Tovat Mar'eh. They are of a beautiful appearance and of beautiful form. This particular phrase describes Rachel herself, her son Yosef, and her descendant Esther. Yefeh Toar v'Tovat Mar'eh. That's Esther. And whatever else this phrase exactly alludes to, the beauty of the children of Rachel seems to really move people. I called it before an evocative sort of beauty. It has charm, perhaps charisma, the type of beauty that attracts people and also induces them to want to act on their behalf, right? We see this right away with Yaakov. Yaakov's first glance of Rachel fills him with some kind of extra physical power, where he is able to roll that boulder off of the well, right? He glimpses Rachel and immediately moves him to try to act, and he gathers strength to move that stone. But the effect of the beauty of the children of Rachel is even more striking, I think, with regard to Yosef and Esther, who are the two children of Rachel that I want to specifically focus on today. And both of their beauty is described as having an effect of chen v'chesed be'enei kol ro'ehem, right? V'tisachin v'chesed lefanav. Chen, some kind of charm, some kind of chesed, some kind of it invokes some kind of attachment, right? Or it evokes some kind of attachment, right? Yosef, throughout his story, is described as gliding effortlessly through life, right? Every time he arrives anywhere, his charms work to his benefit. He's pulled to the top, even when he goes spiraling down, both in terms of the story of his brothers and the story of Potiphar's wife. Each time, wherever he arrives, he seems to kind of be drawn out of his troubles through the fact that people are moved by Yosef, that he is able to obtain chen v'chesed. And we are told he is Yefeh Toar and Yefeh Mar'eh. A similar kind of description involves the story of Esther, right? The minute that Esther arrives at Achashverosh's palace, she attracts the attention of Haggai, the guardian of the women, who offers her all sorts of favors and advantages, right? And of course, Achashverosh's reaction attests to a similar kind of effect. And of course, he makes her the queen as a result of that. It seems pretty clear that Yosef and Esther have this kind of external beauty, this attraction that propels them to their position, to their stature in each of their stories, right? And their stories are very similar, as of course the Midrashim note as well. We have these two figures in Tanakh that attain a position of power in a foreign court, a position which ultimately will help them to assist their family or their nation in their time of need. And yet, what I really want to say about the beauty of these figures is that it seems to me that the Tanakh is drawing our attention to the fact that this beauty is not just a gift. It is also a challenge. Every positive trait has a potentially negative side. And the danger of beauty, the danger of someone who is born with beauty, is that exactly what we said before as the advantage. It's that people with beauty can too easily glide through life by utilizing their beauty. And if so, they can forget that beauty is something that is external, that is superficial, and instead they can begin to ascribe independent value to the beauty, right? And of course, what winds up happening is that the danger of beauty is that the people who have been given this great gift by God run the risk of ascribing too much value to these superficial traits, and of course run the risk of becoming superficial people. And I think that this danger is one that is present in both the Yosef story and the Esther story, which both of these figures, I started out by saying that Esther is the most interesting figure in the Megillah because she develops, she changes, she undergoes some kind of transformation. I think we see something similar with Yosef. I'll get back to Esther in a moment. But I mean, think of Yosef at the beginning of the story, right? The story presents him in the beginning as a dreamer, not just a dreamer, but someone who, tells tales on his brothers, right? He has a position as the favored son, which earns him a cloak from his father, this ketonet pasim that his father gives him. It earns him a favored position in his household. But of course, he does not have the wisdom to get along with his brothers. If you see, Rashi on several occasions cites midrashim which portray Yosef fixing his hair, putting makeup on his eyes in order to beautify himself. And the context of these midrashim is a negative one, right? In this depiction, Yosef is initially enjoying his beauty. He is using it as a means to gain privilege, to enjoy his life of privilege, first in his father's eyes and then in Potiphar's eyes. In both of these stories, of course, the situation implodes and he is sold into slavery by his brothers. He's nearly killed by his brothers, and then he's sold into slavery by them. And of course, in the story of Potiphar, Yosef's beauty ultimately leads to the situation with Potiphar's wife. And of course, Rashi there brings the Midrash, which says that God orchestrates the episode with Potiphar's wife as a result of Yosef's undue attentions that he gives to cultivating his physical appearance. Now, once the story of Potiphar's wife happens with regard to Yosef, and Yosef experiences the dangers of his beauty, he begins to examine life more deeply. He begins to dig deeper than the surface, to search for what underlies that surface advantage that God gives him. And it shouldn't surprise us that Yosef becomes not a dreamer, but an interpreter of dreams, someone who endeavors to understand the meaning beyond the surface, beyond the simple dream. It is Yosef who, by the end of his life, can interpret the broader context of the really rather sordid story of his brother's actions toward him. And in trying to sort of reassure his brothers, he says, Lo atem shlachtem oti hena ki ha'elokim. It was not you who sent me here, it was God, right? Yosef's beauty teaches him to seek beneath the surface, to try to discern the meaning of events, and ultimately to understand what I think we are meant to understand from every gift that God gives us, whether it be beauty or wisdom or physical prowess or artistic abilities. And that is that God gives us these gifts to fulfill our destiny, to position us in a particular position that enables us to contribute to the world, to help our fellow members of Am Yisrael, and of course that's eventually, and of course to serve God as well. That's eventually what Yosef does. He uses his position to help his family survive the famine and to help Egypt to survive the famine as well. And now I want to turn our attention to Esther and note that Esther seems to undergo a similar transformation, at least in the pshat, in the simple meaning of the story, right? Initially, she seems to be a woman of Shushan, right? She is beautiful. She is evocative. She is brought to the palace. She seems to reap the fruits of her allure, right? At the beginning of the story, again, at least according to the Pshat, Esther never speaks, not once. She is passive. She is mute. She is taken to the palace where she is perfumed and pampered and beautified to bring to the king. And Esther seems to, at least at the beginning of the story, float by without paying deep attention to her position, right? She floats by on her physical charms, just as perhaps Yosef did at the beginning of his story. I think the most revealing moment of the story, and maybe the pivotal moment of Megillat Esther, is the moment when Esther hears that Mordechai has appeared before the king's palace, or next to the gate of the king's palace, in sackcloth. And she responds with a very strong response of revulsion and horror. The word that is used, the verb that describes it, is vatitchalchal, right? She is very, very distressed. And we think she's distressed because she has heard not about Mordecai's sitting in front of the gate in sackcloth, but rather she's heard of the terrible decree of genocide. And yet immediately following Esther's response of Vatit Chalchal, we are told not that she then takes pains to try to change the king's decree, but rather Vatishlach Bigadim Halbish et Ulahasir Sako Me'alav. She sends these clothes to try to dress Mordechai and to take the sackcloth off of him. Right? Esther seems to be horrified. Mordechai is dressed in rags, and instead of asking why and what motivated him, she simply sends Mordechai a change of clothes, as if that superficial act will change the situation, instead of asking what motivated the strong response. Now, Esther, at this point in the story, seems to live in the moment, right? She seems to have these kind of superficial values in which beauty is valued for its own sake. She has allowed that beauty to define her and her life's trajectory, right? And at that point, Mordechai sends her back a message and tells her to go to the king and to try to convince the king to change his decree. And she responds negatively. I can't possibly do that. He might kill me. And at this juncture, Mordechai teaches Esther and explains to Esther that she must see deeper, that she must scratch the surface of existence. She must begin to understand the meaning of the trajectory of her life, why she arrived at the place in life that she arrived at. And he tells her, Kim hacharish tacharishi bait hazot. If you will be silent at this time, revach v'hatzala ya'amod la'yudim mimakom acher. Salvation will come to the Jews from a different direction. V'at uvet avich tovedu. Umi yodea, he tells her, and who knows? Im la'et kazot higat lamalchut. If for this time, for this moment, that is the reason that you have arrived at kingship. And he basically tells her, you could live your life just kind of floating on the tidal waves of existence. And then you will live your life without scratching the surface of existence. You will not fulfill your destiny. Ve'at uvet avich tovedu, you and your father's house will be lost. But who knows, he said, why you have been chosen queen. He doesn't tell her why. He doesn't know why. But what he tells her is she must try to understand why she was chosen to be queen. She should not live life on the surface. She should learn to use her beauty, the superficial advantages that God gave her, in order to realize her destiny, in order to gain a deeper understanding of the world and her place within it. She must use her beauty, like Yosef before her, to position her to save her nation. And so what we see, I think, with both Yosef and Esther is a similar kind of trajectory. At the beginning of their lives, their beauty is an obstacle or a potential obstacle. It's a challenge. It can distort their ability to see their roles clearly. It can just give them the option of gliding through life rather effortlessly, and just enjoying their considerable advantage and their charms. But eventually, both of these figures become our great heroic biblical figures because they learn to use their beauty. They learn to realize that their beauty is simply a gift from God, and it is valuable only inasmuch as it helps them to realize their destiny and to obtain long-term enduring values. And one thing that I'll just note as an aside, and then I'll draw this shiur to a close, is that it's interesting. I mentioned before the role of clothing with the children of Rachel, but what's interesting is that the children of Rachel all have to kind of rip their clothing or have their clothes ripped in order to symbolize that they don't value this kind of superficial cultivation of appearance for its own sake, right? Think of Yosef with his ripped clothes, Shaul with his ripped clothes, Yerovam with his ripped clothes, Mordechai with his ripped clothes, right? And except Esther, right? Esther actually does not rip her clothes, but we're told that Esther Talbesh, Esther Malchut, right? She puts on the clothes of kingship, her regal clothes, in order to enter the king's chamber so that she can use her considerable charm to save her people. I'll conclude by saying that, like all God-given traits, the beauty that God gives the children of Rachel must be used for a purpose. It must not be seen as their own personal advantage, given them to do with it as they please, to serve their own self-interest, to promote their own success. And this understanding of beauty, as I said before, has a broader message for properly utilizing and apprehending our role in this world, right? God gives each of us certain gifts, certain raw material, certain advantages, a certain personality and situation in life. And our role is to understand how to take those advantages, whether they be, as I said, physical ones, in strength or beauty or intelligence or artistic abilities or even wealth. And we must use that raw material and turn it into our destiny. It is our responsibility to use that raw material to mold ourselves into people who are worthy of those gifts which God has given us, and to use them in service of God, in service of our nation, and in order to contribute to the world. I wish you all a Purim Sameach and continued growth in Torah learning.